Malcolm X, one of the most articulate exponents of the black Muslim philosophy, has said of your movement and your philosophy that it plays into the hands of the white oppressors, that they are happy to hear you talk about love for the oppressor because this disarms the Negro and fits into the stereotype of the Negro as a neat, turning the other cheek sort of creature. Would you care to comment on Mr. X's?
I must confess that that dream that I had that day has at many points turned into a nightmare.
I must confess that that dream that I had that day has at many points turned into a nightmare. Turned into a nightmare. Turned into a nightmare. Turned into a nightmare.
That dream that I had that day has at many points
turned into a nightmare.
You're goddamn right.
You know, the last thing Dr. King said to me before he was murdered, Martin said, you know, I sit here deeply concerned that I suspect we are leading our nation on an integration trip that has us integrating into a burning house. Most of the politicians I know of make promises only to walk into the places of power and then deny us. I guess part of the reason I'm here is to really look through the ravages of the Democratic Party and see if anything is really worth salvaging. Dr. King ever said to me 5 days, as a matter of fact, before he was murdered, was he was at my home. We had just finished a strategy meeting on the Poor People's Campaign. And he seemed quite agitated after what we thought was a very successful gathering and discussion. And he said to me, I said, what's the matter, Martin? You seem very agitated. He said, well, I am. Because I've come upon a thought, but I don't know how to deal with it this moment. I said, well, what is it? He says, we fought long for integration. It looks like we're going to get it. I think we get the laws. He says, but I'm afraid that I've come upon something I don't know quite what to do with. I'm afraid that we're integrating into a burning house.
I must confess that that dream that I had that day has at many points turned into a nightmare.
And I say this morning that it is my hope that every young man in this country who finds this war objectionable and abominable and unjust would file as a conscientious objector.
The so-called Negro community has shocked the white man by resisting all efforts to divide us. I think that you and I should continue to shock him by staying and working together in unity. Despite religious, political, economic, or educational or social differences, let us remember that we are not brutalized because we're Baptists. We're not brutalized because we're Methodists. We're not brutalized because we're Muslims. We're not brutalized because we're Catholics. We're brutalized because we are black people in America.
And no matter what you think of Mr. Muhammad Ali's religion, you certainly have to admire his courage.
People are going to live together at all. You've got to recognize that your race was responsible for some bad things, and my race was responsible.
Our race, they're still responsible for not coming together and sticking together, pooling the resources, education and qualifications for self-independence. After being educated for 100 years, still marching and begging white people for jobs, and we can go out and make jobs ourselves. We were free, so-called freed 100 years ago. The Honorable Elijah Muhammad's been here for 38 years preaching the truth. It's all here if they just accept it. So I would say we at fault in this way for now being free and not taking advantage of it.
But now, you sound, when you go too far, though, you sound like a sort of black Governor Wallace figure, almost, advocating a very, very strong line. Surely you should try advocating people coming together, shouldn't you?
Who coming together?
Black and white, of some way. We've got to sort things out.
I'm afraid of that because they kill all the people that do that.
No, they don't. No.
All the people that preach that are dead. All of them, even white. They dead. The ones who preach, let's get together. They seem to catch all the hell, but the militants, they seem to get all the respect. So the people want to get the respect.
No, so there have been tragedies associated with militants too, like Malcolm X and so on. Tragedies associated.
Well, he was preaching getting together too when that happened, if you remember.
Not very much.
Well, you know, that's when he started saying you all right and all that, and we should get along with white folks. That's when that happened.
Where your mother is being raped and you're not supposed to be emotional. Your women, please, your women can't walk the street without some cracker putting his hands on her, then you're not supposed to be emotional.
At the very same time that America refused to give the Negro any land, through an act of Congress, our government was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that it was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe with an economic floor. But not only did they give the land, they built land-grant colleges with government money to teach them how to farm. Not only that, they provided county agents to further their expertise in farming. Not only that, they provided low interest rates in order that they could mechanize their farms. Not only that, today many of these people are receiving millions of dollars in federal subsidies not to farm, and they are the very people telling the black man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. Now, this is what we are faced with, and this is the reality. Now, when we come to Washington, in this campaign, we are coming to get our check.
Now, the other thing that we've got to come to see now that many of us didn't see too well during the last 10 years, that is that racism
not guilty
is still alive in American society and much more widespread.
Broke his neck after Baltimore police.
A handful of protesters, a handful of criminals and thugs who...
Many in moments of anger, many in moments of deep bitterness, engage in riots. And as long as America postpones justice, we stand in the position of having these recurrences of violence and riots over and over again. Social justice and progress are the absolute guarantors of riot prevention.
Mr. Gray's death was a homicide.
The Negro was freed from the bondage of physical slavery.
The athletes marched onto a stage.
But at the same time, the nation refused to give him land to make that freedom meaningful. Freedom without land to cultivate. Freedom and famine at the same time.
And create jobs for our people.
The Negro is to be free. He must move down into the inner resources of his own soul and sign with a pen and ink of self-assertive manhood his own emancipation proclamation. But I want to get the language right tonight. I want to get the language so right that everybody here will cry out, yes, I'm black, I'm proud of it, I'm black and beautiful. Individually, we are poor when you compare us with white society in America. We are poor. Collectively, we are richer than all the nations in the world with the exception of 9. That's power right there if we know how to prove it. We begin the process of building a greater economic base. And at the same time, we are putting pressure where it really hurts. We don't have to argue with anybody. We just need to go around to these stores and to these massive industries in our country. Say, God sent us by here to say to you that you're not treating his children right. We come by here to ask you to make the first item on your agenda fair treatment where God's children are concerned. Now, if you're not prepared to do that, we do have an agenda that we must follow. Our agenda calls for withdrawing economic support from you. We mean business now, and we are determined to gain our rightful place.
Who was working against Dr. King in his own office back in Georgia? One of those pimping pastors who was so mad at King because he was getting all the attention and dared turn the church into a revolutionary force instead of a let's just get ready for heaven force. Because you know he had to fight the elders in the church. They couldn't stand Dr. King. Because he said, we can't just sit here and talk about Jesus and not work. Dr. King was not a nationalist, but I respect him. He went to Marcus Garvey's gravesite in Jamaica right after Malcolm died, before he was killed. And he said Marcus Garvey was the first significant leader to organize black people in America. And people around King said that when he came back to America after visiting Mr. Garvey in Jamaica, his grave, they said he started giving speeches like Garvey. And that's where the CIA and FBI moved in on King. You got to read King's speeches the last year of his life. See, the white man handpicked speeches for y'all to read. When you get a Dr. King CD, he handpicked I Have a Dream, Mountaintop. He don't give you the good stuff. He don't give you that Marcus Garvey Dr. King. He give you King the Integrationist. That's why you got to get the anthology of all of King's speeches and read the ones at the last year. Stop being lazy. Read that last year of Dr. King. You would think you're reading Marcus Garvey or Malcolm. What did Marcus Garvey say? Some of us going to die. You get up to do this work, you're going to die. But he said, that ain't the problem, that you might die. The problem is we ain't got nobody to replace you. Dr. King died in 1968. He had his faults. Dr. King wasn't perfect. But he was damn sure committed, at least in the final years. Who got up to take King's place after he died? Nobody. Look at it, Shaw. What, we 45 years after King, you ain't get nobody significant yet. Who, Jesse? Al? Who you got? 45 years and you still ain't get a replacement for King. 50 years, you ain't get a replacement for Malcolm. Damn near 100 years, you ain't get a replacement for Garvey. 50 years, you ain't get a replacement for Medgar Evers, who we always conveniently leave out of the discussion. He was the first one to do it. Marcus Garvey said, leaders must die, but you must have others to replace them. The problem with the black community is we don't groom our next generation of leaders. We go to church and pray for the Christ to send us one. And then the FBI sends you one. If you want leaders, you got to make them. You got to make leaders. You don't wish for them. You don't pray for them. That's why you don't get none, because you ain't manufacturing leaders. You got to have black men who are, black boys who are raised from childhood, knowing that they might got to pay the ultimate sacrifice for their people.
I think America must see that riots do not develop out of thin air. Certain conditions continue to exist in our society, which must be condemned as vigorously. In the final analysis, a riot is the language of the unheard. What is it that America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last few years. It has failed to hear that the promises of freedom and justice have not been met. And it has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice, equality, and humanity. And so in a real sense, our nation's summers of riots are caused by our nation's winters of delay. And as long as America postpones justice, we stand in the position of having these recurrences of violence and riots over and over again. Social justice and progress are the absolute guarantors of riot prevention. Now, in order to develop these massive action programs, we've got to get rid of one or two false notions that continue to exist in our society. One is the notion that only time can solve the problem of racial injustice. I'm sure you've heard this idea. It is the notion almost that is something in the very flow of time that will miraculously cure all evils. And I've heard this over and over again. There are those, and they're often sincere people, who say to Negroes and their allies in the white community that we should slow up and just be nice and patient and continue to pray, and in 100 or 200 years the problem will work itself out, because only time can solve the problem. I think that is an answer to that myth, and it is that time is neutral. It can be used either constructively or destructively. And I'm absolutely convinced that the forces of ill will in our nation, the extreme rightists in our nation, have often used time much more effectively than the forces of goodwill. And it may well be that we will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the vitriolic words of the bad people and the violent actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence and indifference of the good people who sit around and say, wait on time. Somewhere we must come to see that social progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts and the persistent work of dedicated individuals, and without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the primitive forces of social stagnation. And so we must help time, and we must realize that the time is always right to do right. And that is that although it may be true that morality cannot be legislated, behavior can be regulated. Even though it may be true that the law cannot change the heart, it can restrain the heartless. Even though it may be true that the law cannot make a man love me, it can restrain him from lynching me, and I think that's pretty important also. Now, I'm convinced that we still need strong civil rights legislation.
Led by Dr. King, came to finish what James Meredith had started. But this time, they were joined by SNCC and its youthful leader, Stokely Carmichael. You have two generations, the generation that Martin Luther King Jr. represents and the generation that Stokely Carmichael represents. And Dr. King's message was really wearing thin in this latter half of the 1960s, particularly because there's so much violence.
As the violence grew, the willingness to be passive declined.
Expression of our determination to be free.
No one in this country is asking the white community in the South to be nonviolent, and that in a sense is giving them a free license to go ahead and shoot us at will. I just don't see it as a way of life. I never have.
The Meredith March is where Stokely Carmichael becomes an icon.
No one in this country is asking the white community in the South to be nonviolent, and that in a sense is giving them a free license to go ahead and shoot us at will.
Carmichael and the militant activists, they're thinking that civil rights has not gone far enough. They want liberation and freedom now.
What do you want? What do you want? When do you want it? How much of it do you want? That tells me that you're going to march with us, and we're going to see. If you continue doing so, you will be placed under arrest.
We don't want anybody to move. The time for running has come to an end. You tell them white folk in Mississippi that all the scared niggas are dead. You tell them they shot all the rabbits, they're gonna deal with some men.
Mississippi state troopers who had once been assigned to protect the marchers now took another stance.
I want to get this over because this is important. We're going to stick together. If necessary, we are willing to fill up all of the jails in the state of Mississippi. And I don't believe they have enough jails to hold the people if they try to arrest us here. Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you are too arrogant. If you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power. And I'll place it in the hands of a nation that doesn't even know my name. Be still and know that I'm God.
It is real ignorant for any leader to say to you that you should be aggressive against the white people of America with nothing. You got nothing to fight the white people with, so why should you be so foolish to want to be aggressive? God did not send me here to teach you to be aggressive, but to be peaceful.
Though we may have different religious beliefs, this does not at all bring about a difference in terms of our concern.
It was the fastest thing you'd ever seen, and the reason he had it his way with everybody is because he was middleweight. He was so fast. You couldn't. couldn't beat this. He could hit you. He wasn't really thick. He was long. His arms were long, but I liked him because soft-spoken, number one. The only time he got loud is when he was trying to intimidate another fighter. But when he was speaking to people and publicly, he was a very quiet individual. I liked him because he stood up for himself, and he stood up for a lot of people. He was the Pied Piper. Nobody followed him too much, and he could have been. If he wouldn't have been a fighter, Martin Luther King was a great man. But I'll tell you, Muhammad Ali would have been a close second.
But a lot of people out here listen to our leader talk, and they look at him and say, well, he's just another man with some program for Negroes. But if you could travel around the world like I have, if you could go to Nigeria, Ghana, Cairo, Egypt, and talk to rulers of the world, and as soon as I talked to President Nasser, for an example, the first thing he said was, how's the Honorable Elijah Muhammad? No leader, I'm not naming no organizations, I'm not naming no leaders, but I've been all over into the deepest parts of Africa and Egypt, all back in various countries in Egypt, and everybody know and are talking about the Muslims in America. Yes. Everybody. And if it was not for the teachings of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, not bragging, but a man in my position, that would be the last place I would go, is Africa and Egypt. The first stop would have been Paris, London, France, like rest of them. The Muslims that control the pyramids for sightseers, they pulled the rock out of the pyramid and gave it to me to bring back for all of the Muslims here to have. It weighs 2,500 pounds. The actual rock from a pyramid from Egypt. They said they've never done nothing like it before, and if I wasn't a Muslim, I wouldn't have got it. Say that I felt so guilty and I felt so greedy receiving all of the gifts because I was a Muslim, and if it wasn't for the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, I never would have heard about this or even thought about going to these countries. And this is a golden Muslim mosque that was presented to me by the Islamic Council of all Egypt.
Here's another thing I want you to remember. How much people think of the God that they serve. They build golden mosques. They don't care nothing about the gold. You over here wrangling, fussing, quarreling over a little piece of gold. We build houses out of gold. I gave it to him yet.
And I want one more thing to say I haven't explained it yet. And this mosque, I'm very honored, and I hope that he will receive it. This is a gift, our leading teacher, for waking all of us up, because we were in a bad state of condition before we heard him. Yes, sir!
The last thing Dr. King ever said to me, 5 days, as a matter of fact, before he was murdered, was he was at my home. We had just finished a strategy meeting on the Poor People's Campaign. And he seemed quite agitated after what we thought was a very successful gathering and discussion. And he said to me, I said, what's the matter, Martin? You seem very agitated. He said, well, I am. Because I've come upon a thought, but I don't know how to deal with it this moment. I said, well, what is it? He says, we fought long for integration. It looks like we're going to get it. I think we get the laws. He says, but I'm afraid that I've come upon something I don't know quite what to do with. I'm afraid that we're integrating into a burning house.
I'm afraid that we're integrating into a burning house.
Don't let anybody take your manhood. Be proud of our heritage. As somebody said earlier tonight, we don't have anything to be ashamed of. Somebody told a lie one day. They couched it in language. They made everything black, ugly, and evil. Look in your dictionary and see the synonyms of the word black. It's always something degrading and low and sinister. Look at the word white. It's always something pure, high, and clean. I want to get the language so right that everybody here will cry out, yes, I'm black, I'm proud of it, I'm black and beautiful.
I'm afraid that we're integrating into a burning house. And when we asked for further clarification, Andy Young was with me at that time, my wife, others. He said America's lost whatever little moral vision it had. Its moral sense has run away from the nation. And a nation that is not governed by morality and moral principles is a nation that's headed for an abyss. And I think black people have been struggling to get into this system, maybe getting into a system that in the final analysis is a Sodom and Gomorrah, will not work. Because its selfish goals, its need for profit, its need for supremacy, its need to be the best has clouded its moral vision. And with no moral vision, no nation can be healthy enough to lead its people anywhere except to destruction.
All we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right. And so just as I say we aren't going to let any dogs or water hoses turn us around, we aren't going to let any injunction turn us around. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
This is a CBS News special report.
Dan Rather reporting for CBS News from New York. The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was shot to death by an assassin late today as he stood on a balcony in Memphis, Tennessee.
The job of arousing manhood within a people that have been taught for so many centuries that they are nobody is not easy.
So they very skillfully made you and me hate our African identity.
Maybe the English language should be reconstructed so that teachers will not be forced to teach the Negro child 60 ways to despise himself and thereby perpetuate his false sense of inferiority.
And in hating our features and our skin and our blood, why we had to end up hating ourselves. It made us feel inferior.
We must no longer be ashamed of being black.
We should own and operate and control the economy of our community. And once you and I go into business, we own and operate at least the businesses in our community. What we will be doing is developing a situation wherein we will actually be able to create employment for the people in the community.
We hope to build housing from Mississippi to North Carolina using Negro workmen, Negro architects, Negro attorneys, and Negro financial institutions throughout, and with millions and millions of dollars in income coming to the Negro community. Now, another basic challenge is to discover how to organize our strength into economic and political power.
Whenever you find a man who's in a position to show power against power, then that man is respected. But you can take a man who has power and love him all the rest of your life. You won't get anything out of it.
What is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and that love without power is sentimental and anemic.
The only thing power respects is power.
There is nothing wrong with power.
They would drop bombs on African villages that would blow that village apart and everything in it. Man, woman, child, and baby. No outcry, no sympathy, no support, no concern, because the press didn't project it in such a way that it would be designed to get your sympathy. With skillful manipulating of the press, they're able to make the victim look like the criminal, and the criminal look like the victim.
There's something strangely inconsistent about a nation and a press that will praise you when you say be nonviolent toward Jim Clark, but will curse and damn you when you say be nonviolent toward little brown Vietnamese children.
Yet the United States government went and got Chomby in Spain and put him as the head of the Congolese government. Imagine this. This is criminal. Here's a man who's a murderer. So the United States takes him, puts him over the Congo, and supports his government with your tax dollars. And he turns, his first move is to bring in South Africans who hate everything in sight. He hires those South Africans to come and kill his own Congolese people. And the United States, again, pays their salary.
And who are we supporting in Vietnam today? It's a man by the name of General Key, who fought with the French against his own people, and who said on one occasion that the greatest hero of his life is Hitler. This is who we are supporting in Vietnam today. Oh, our government and the press generally won't tell us these things, but God told me to tell you this morning. The truth must be told.